The humidity in Savannah hung thick that August morning when Dr. Rebecca Morrison first laid eyes on the photograph. The archive room of the Coastal Georgia Historical Society smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. But nothing in her 15 years as a historian had prepared her for what she was about to uncover. Rebecca had been cataloguing a donated collection from the estate of Harold Pemberton, a reclusive collector who died at 93. Most items were mundane: land deeds, cotton receipts, society announcements. Then she found the metal case. It was heavier than expected, ornately decorated with tarnished scrollwork. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was an extraordinary daguerreotype. The image quality was remarkable for 1847, the date inscribed on the back. 7 young men stood in a rigid line, their faces bearing an unsettling similarity. Brothers. The notation confirmed it. The Whitmore brothers, Chatham County, Georgia, 1847. Rebecca adjusted her magnifying glass and leaned closer. The brothers ranged from perhaps 14 to 30, all in dark suits, their expressions locked in that blank stare common to early photography. But something was wrong. She switched on the lamp and photographed the daguerreotype for closer examination. Uploading the image to her computer, she zoomed in. Rebecca's coffee grew cold as she stared at the screen. Her hand trembled as she increased magnification on the third brother's face. There, barely visible behind his left ear, was something that shouldn't exist in a photograph from 1847. A mark. Dark, deliberate, unmistakable. It looked like a brand. She zoomed in on each brother's neck. The youngest had a similar mark, the second eldest, just above his collar. These weren't artifacts or damage. These were intentional marks on human skin, captured by the camera's eye. Rebecca reached for her phone, then hesitated. She needed more information first. Who were these brothers? What had happened to them? The Pemberton collection yielded little else initially. She spent the next 3 days combing through census records, property deeds, church registries. The Whitmore family had owned a modest plantation outside Savannah. The brothers were well known in local society. Then, in March of 1848, they vanished. All 7 brothers disappeared within 2 weeks. The youngest, Thomas, age 14, was last seen leaving church on a Sunday. Within days, the others began vanishing until only Jonathan remained. He filed missing persons reports, offered rewards, placed advertisements from Charleston to New Orleans. 3 weeks later, Jonathan Whitmore was found dead in the Savannah River. The coroner ruled it suicide by drowning, but the physician noted unusual scarring on the neck and upper back, origin unknown. Rebecca printed the report and laid it beside the photograph. The archive room had emptied, leaving her alone with the humming lights and 7 faces staring up at her. She examined the daguerreotype case again. Something small and white was wedged in the velvet lining. Using tweezers, she extracted a folded piece of paper, thin and fragile. The handwriting was cramped, written in faded pencil. She laid it under the magnifying glass. They come in the night. They say we volunteered, but we did not. They say it is for the greater good. But whose good? Not ours. The marks burn. Thomas cries, but they do not care. Mother and father know nothing. We are forbidden to speak of it. Jonathan resists. They say he will be the first to go. I am writing this because if you find it, you must know. We did not choose this. We had no freedom to refuse. Look for the others. We are not the first. We will not be the last. God forgive them, for we cannot. There was no signature, but the handwriting matched documents Rebecca had seen from the Whitmore family papers. She sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. This wasn't just a historical curiosity anymore. This was evidence of something horrific. She photographed the note, then carefully returned it to the case. Tomorrow she would contact colleagues. Tonight, she needed to process what she'd discovered. Rebecca locked the archive and walked through Savannah's historic district. The elegant squares, draped in Spanish moss, felt oppressive tonight, as if the old houses concealed secrets they'd kept for centuries. At home, she couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. She pulled up the digital image, zooming in on each brother's face. Their eyes weren't vacant from exposure times. They were terrified, utterly terrified, and trying desperately not to show it. She began researching antebellum Georgia history, medical experiments, criminal organizations. But the Whitmores were white, wealthy, and free. What could have made 7 grown men so afraid? At 2 in the morning, Rebecca found a reference in a dissertation about secret societies in the coastal South. The author mentioned rumors of a group called the Assembly of Progress that had operated in Georgia and South Carolina in the 1840s. Members were prominent citizens who believed in advancing civilization through selective improvement of the human condition. The dissertation noted that records were scarce, possibly destroyed, but several unexplained disappearances between 1845 and 1850 might be connected. The Assembly allegedly conducted experiments on subjects who had volunteered for the betterment of society. Rebecca's blood ran cold. She printed the relevant pages. The photograph had become more than a historical artifact. It was evidence of systematic abuse. The next morning, she called Dr. Marcus Chen, a colleague specializing in 19th century medical history. She explained the photograph, the note, the disappearances. Marcus was silent. Then he said, "Rebecca, you need to be very careful with this. I've heard whispers about these secret societies. Some sources suggest they weren't just localized to the 1840s. There are patterns spanning decades, even into the 20th century. If you've found actual evidence, there could be people who don't want that information public." People? Marcus, this happened in 1847. Everyone involved is long dead. Are they? Organizations persist, Rebecca. Ideologies persist. Money and power persist. If the Assembly existed, if it conducted experiments on unwilling subjects, don't you think the families involved would want that buried? Rebecca felt a chill. So, what are you saying? Document everything. Make copies. Store them in multiple locations. And don't do this alone. I'm coming to Savannah this weekend. She spent the next 3 days meticulously documenting every aspect of her discovery. She photographed the daguerreotype, scanned the note, compiled her research. She made 3 copies, one for the archive, one uploaded to cloud storage, one mailed to her sister in Oregon. Marcus arrived Saturday morning. When Rebecca showed him the photograph, the note, and her research, his expression grew grave. "This is significant," he said, examining the daguerreotype. "These marks, they're brands. Someone deliberately burned these symbols into their skin. And look here." He pointed to the youngest brother's wrist. "Scarring consistent with restraints." They spent the day in the archive, going through the Pemberton collection with renewed focus. They found 3 more references to the Whitmore brothers. A church program from Christmas 1847, listing Jonathan Whitmore as absent due to family illness, a letter from a Savannah merchant refusing to extend credit to the family after the disappearances, citing concerns about their reliability, and a property deed showing the Whitmore plantation sold at auction in 1849 for a fraction of its value. "Someone destroyed this family," Marcus said, "systematically. First the brothers, then their reputation, then their property. This wasn't random violence. This was organized." On Monday morning, Rebecca received an email that made her pause mid-coffee. The sender was listed as A. Pemberton, and the subject line read simply, "Regarding the daguerreotype." She opened it with trembling fingers. "Dr. Morrison, I am Arthur Pemberton, Harold Pemberton's grandson. I understand you have been examining materials from his estate, particularly a daguerreotype of 7 brothers, dated 1847. I must speak with you urgently about this item. My grandfather spent his final decades researching the subjects of that photograph, and I believe his findings would be of significant interest to your work. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. This matter is time-sensitive. Arthur Pemberton. A phone number followed, with a Savannah area code. Rebecca showed the email to Marcus, who had extended his stay to help with the research. Could be legitimate, he said, or could be someone who wants to know what you've found. How did he know you were looking at the daguerreotype specifically? I haven't publicized it. I've barely told anyone except you. Then someone at the Historical Society must have mentioned it to him, or... Marcus paused. His family has been monitoring who accesses the Pemberton collection. Rebecca's stomach tightened. That's paranoid. Is it? Think about what we're dealing with here. If there's truth to this assembly of progress, if powerful families were involved, they'd have every reason to track who's investigating their history. Despite Marcus's concerns, Rebecca called Arthur Pemberton that afternoon. His voice was cultured, educated, with the soft accent of old Savannah money. He insisted on meeting in person, suggesting a coffee shop near Forsyth Park. Come alone, he added. What I have to share is sensitive, and I don't want to attract attention. Marcus objected strenuously, but Rebecca was determined. I'll meet him in a public place. I'll keep my phone on. If he's Harold Pemberton's grandson, he might have information we can't get anywhere else. The coffee shop was busy with the afternoon crowd, students from SCAD and tourists seeking refuge from the heat. Arthur Pemberton was easy to identify. A distinguished man in his mid-60s, wearing a linen suit and carrying a leather portfolio. He ordered them both coffee and led her to a corner table. Thank you for meeting me, Dr. Morrison. I apologize for the cryptic email, but my grandfather was very clear about the sensitivity of his research. Arthur opened the portfolio and removed a file folder. Harold Pemberton spent 40 years investigating the disappearance of the Whitmore brothers. It became an obsession after he discovered he was descended from one of them. Rebecca's eyes widened. Which one? The youngest, Thomas Whitmore. My grandfather's research proved that Thomas didn't die in 1848. He escaped, changed his name, and eventually settled in Charleston. He married, had children, and lived until 1891, but he never spoke of what happened to him or his brothers. On his deathbed, he gave his daughter a single instruction: find the truth and set them free. Arthur slid a photograph across the table. It showed an elderly man with a long white beard, his eyes haunted even in old age. Thomas Whitmore in 1890, 1 year before his death. My great-great-great-grandfather. Look at his neck. Rebecca looked. Even in the old photograph, she could see the edge of a scar disappearing beneath his collar, the same mark visible in the 1847 daguerreotype. My grandfather inherited Thomas's personal effects, including a journal he kept late in life. Most of it is mundane, daily activities, weather, observations about his garden. But there are passages, encrypted passages that took my grandfather years to decipher. They describe what happened to the Whitmore brothers. Rebecca leaned forward. Tell me. Arthur glanced around the coffee shop, then lowered his voice. The Assembly of Progress was real. It was founded in 1843 by a group of physicians, scientists, and wealthy planters who believed they could improve human beings through selective experimentation. They targeted young men from good families, told their parents it was a prestigious educational opportunity, a chance to participate in advancing medical science. But it wasn't voluntary, Rebecca said. No, the boys were essentially kidnapped, taken to a facility somewhere in the coastal lowlands, between Savannah and Charleston. There, they were subjected to experiments, medical procedures, psychological manipulation, physical endurance tests. The assembly believed they could create a superior class of citizens, people who would lead society into a new age of progress. That's monstrous. It gets worse. The brothers were divided into groups based on the assembly's assessment of their potential. Some were deemed promising and received what the assembly called enhancement procedures. Others were classified as control subjects and used as baselines for comparison. Thomas was in the control group. He watched his brothers undergo procedures that changed them, damaged them. Arthur's hands shook slightly as he opened the file folder. Inside were photocopies of journal entries in spidery handwriting. This is Thomas's account, translated from the code he used. He describes how his brother Samuel went blind after one procedure, how Marcus lost the ability to speak, how David became prone to violent seizures, and how Jonathan, the eldest, who tried to resist, was made an example of. Rebecca felt sick. The coroner said Jonathan drowned himself. Jonathan was murdered. Thomas witnessed it. The assembly couldn't have one of their subjects going public, telling authorities what had happened. So they staged his suicide and sent a clear message to any other potential resistors. Why didn't Thomas go to the authorities himself? He tried, but the assembly members were the authorities. The county sheriff, the mayor, prominent judges, successful physicians. Who would believe a traumatized teenager over the pillars of the community? Thomas realized his only option was to run, to disappear so completely they couldn't find him. Arthur pulled out another document. This is a partial list my grandfather compiled of assembly members. Some names you'll recognize. Families that are still prominent in Savannah and Charleston society. This is why the research is sensitive, Dr. Morrison. These families have spent nearly 2 centuries burying this history. My grandfather received threats, had his research stolen more than once. He became so paranoid, he kept the most important documents in a safety deposit box that only I could access after his death. And now you're sharing this with me. Why? Arthur's expression was pained. Because I have cancer. Stage 4. I have maybe 6 months. My grandfather made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would continue the work. I'm the last of the line, Dr. Morrison. After me, there's no one to tell this story. You're a historian, a scholar. You have the credibility and the platform to bring this to light properly. Rebecca studied the man across from her. He looked exhausted, as if sharing this information had drained what little energy he had left. What do you want me to do? Document everything. Publish your findings in academic journals where they can't be dismissed as conspiracy theories. Make sure the Whitmore brothers, all 7 of them, are remembered not as suicide victims or runaways, but as prisoners, as subjects of systematic abuse sanctioned by society's elite. He pushed the entire portfolio across the table. This is everything my grandfather compiled: names, dates, locations. He even found the probable site of the Assembly's facility, though it was destroyed by fire in 1851, conveniently erasing most physical evidence. Take it, use it. Just promise me you'll be careful. The families involved still have resources, still have influence. Rebecca accepted the portfolio, feeling its weight literally and figuratively. I promise. I'll handle this with the utmost care and professionalism. Arthur Pemberton stood, leaning heavily on the table. There's one more thing. My grandfather believed the assembly didn't end in the 1850s. He found evidence of similar patterns in later decades. Different names, different locations, but the same fundamental approach: identifying vulnerable populations, promising advancement or opportunity, and then exploiting them for experimentation. The ideology didn't die, Dr. Morrison. It just became more sophisticated, better hidden. He handed her a business card. My personal number. Call me if you need clarification on anything in those documents, but please work quickly. I don't know how much time I have, and once I'm gone, they might try to suppress this again. After Arthur left, Rebecca sat alone with the portfolio, her coffee long cold. She opened it and began reading. The documents were meticulously organized, photocopies of journal entries, property records, membership rosters, even financial ledgers showing payments made by assembly members for facility maintenance and subject acquisition. One entry from Thomas Whitmore's journal, dated December 1847, made her eyes water. "They took David today for another procedure. He screamed for mother. I held Samuel, who cannot see the tears on my face, and we prayed together. Marcus cannot pray anymore. They took his words. Jonathan says we must resist, but I am afraid. I am so afraid. They tell us this is for the greater good, that our sacrifice will advance humanity, but I see no good in Samuel's blindness, no advancement in Marcus's silence. I see only cruelty wrapped in the language of progress. They have branded us like cattle, marked us as their property. We are no longer free men. We are their experiment, and they care nothing for our suffering." Rebecca closed the portfolio and pulled out her phone. Marcus answered immediately. "You were right to be concerned," she said. "This is bigger than I imagined, and we need to move faster than I thought." They spent that evening in Rebecca's apartment, going through Arthur Pemberton's documents. Marcus created a database, cataloguing every name, date, and location mentioned. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its scope. "Look at this," Marcus said, pointing to a timeline he'd constructed. "The Assembly of Progress operated openly from 1843 to 1851. Then the facility burns down and official records stop. But look at these unexplained disappearances." He highlighted entries from 1855, 1862, 1871, each cluster involving young men from similar demographic profiles. "Same age range, same social class, same geographic area," Rebecca observed. "And look at the professions of the missing: students, apprentices, young men in transitional periods of their lives, people whose absence might be explained away as them seeking opportunity elsewhere." "Exactly. And now, look at this." Marcus pulled up a modern database. "I started searching for similar patterns in more recent decades. Young men, ages 16 to 30, disappearing from coastal Georgia and South Carolina, not runaways with troubled backgrounds, but stable middle-class kids who vanish without a trace. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 50 years, more than 200 young men had disappeared from the region under circumstances that defied easy explanation. Most cases went cold within months. Some were eventually ruled runaways or suicides despite lack of evidence. Very few were ever solved. "This can't all be connected," Rebecca said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Probably not all of it, but the statistical clustering is significant. And look at this." Marcus opened another file, Harold Pemberton's notes from the 1980s. He was investigating a disappearance in 1983. A college student named Michael Torres, who vanished from Savannah State. Pemberton found evidence Torres had been recruited for a medical study, offering substantial compensation. The study was sponsored by a foundation with ties to descendants of original assembly members. Did he ever find Torres? No, but he found 3 other young men who'd been recruited for similar studies. One agreed to talk, off the record. He described being taken to a facility, undergoing psychological testing and physical examinations, and then becoming suspicious when the procedures became more invasive than the consent forms indicated. He refused further participation and was released, but warned that if he spoke publicly, he would face legal consequences for breaking his confidentiality agreement. Rebecca rubbed her eyes. It was past midnight, and the implications of what they were uncovering felt overwhelming. "We need to be systematic about this. We can't just throw out wild accusations. We need evidence, documentation, a clear chain of causation." "Agreed, but we also need to work fast." Arthur Pemberton said he has 6 months. If he's the last person with direct knowledge of his grandfather's research, we need to interview him extensively before it's too late. They created a plan. Rebecca would focus on the historical research, documenting the original Assembly of Progress and the Whitmore case in rigorous academic detail. Marcus would investigate the modern disappearances, looking for patterns and any connections to the families identified in Harold Pemberton's research. Together, they would build a case that could withstand scrutiny from both the academic community and any parties who might want to discredit them. Over the next 3 weeks, Rebecca practically lived in archives. She traveled to Charleston, Columbia, and Atlanta, examining records that corroborated elements of the Pemberton research. She found property deeds for a coastal estate that matched the location Harold Pemberton had identified as the Assembly's facility. Insurance records showed the property had indeed burned in 1851, with investigators noting the fire appeared to be deliberately set, though no one was ever charged. She located descendants of 2 other young men who'd disappeared in the 1840s, families who'd preserved letters and journals mentioning mysterious educational opportunities and concerns about sons who'd stopped communicating. The patterns were consistent with the Whitmore case. Marcus made equally disturbing progress. He identified 12 disappearances since 1970 that shared key characteristics. Young men recruited for medical or psychological studies, last seen heading to appointments at facilities that later proved difficult or impossible to locate. Families stonewalled by institutions claiming no knowledge of any such studies. In 4 cases, bodies had eventually been found. All showed signs of medical intervention, surgical scars, evidence of pharmaceutical use. In one case, marks consistent with electrode placement for neurological testing. Coroners had ruled them suicides or accidental overdoses, but the families insisted their sons had no history of drug use or mental health issues. "I found something else," Marcus said during one of their evening work sessions. "A shell corporation that's been purchasing land in rural Chatham County, the same area where the original assembly facility was located. The corporation is 6 layers deep, but I traced the ownership back to a holding company controlled by 3 families, all descended from known assembly members. What are they doing with the land? That's the question. Officially, it's held for agricultural development, but there's been no farming activity. I drove out there last week. It's just empty land, heavily fenced, with no trespassing signs everywhere. But there's fresh tire tracks, evidence of recent construction or excavation. Rebecca felt the familiar chill. We need to see this. Rebecca, that's dangerous. If they're actually doing something out there, showing up uninvited is going to alert them that we're investigating. Then we don't go uninvited. We go with a legitimate reason." She pulled up county records on her laptop. The property line borders the Savannah National Wildlife Refuge. We can legally access the refuge, and if we happen to observe the private property from public land, that's perfectly legal. Marcus sighed. "You know this is how horror movies start, right? Researchers investigating mysterious property and disappearing themselves. Which is why we tell multiple people exactly where we're going, when we'll be back, and what to do if we don't return. We're not stupid, Marcus, we're careful." The following Saturday, they drove out to the refuge at dawn, equipped with hiking gear, binoculars, and cameras. The area was beautiful in the early morning light, coastal marshes alive with birds and the rustle of sea breeze through spartina grass. They followed a trail that brought them to the property's eastern border. Through binoculars, Rebecca could see the fencing Marcus had described, industrial-grade chain link topped with barbed wire. Beyond it, cleared land and what appeared to be a gravel-access road leading into a stand of live oaks. No buildings were visible from their vantage point. There, Marcus pointed, fresh tracks, recent, probably within the last day or 2. They photographed everything, documenting the fence line, the tracks, the cleared areas. Then Marcus's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "You're on private property. Leave now or face prosecution." They weren't on private property. They were clearly on the refuge side of the fence, but someone was watching them. "Time to go," Rebecca said, trying to keep her voice steady. They hiked back to their car quickly but without running, not wanting to show fear. As they drove away, Rebecca checked her rearview mirror repeatedly. No one followed, but the message was clear. They were being monitored. "They know who we are," Marcus said. "They know what we're researching." "Good," Rebecca replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Let them know we're not backing down. Let them know their secrets are coming out." But that night, alone in her apartment, she felt less confident. She triple-checked her locks, jumped at every sound. The faces of the Whitmore brothers stared at her from the photograph on her desk. 7 young men who'd trusted the wrong people, believed the wrong promises, and paid with their freedom and their lives. She pulled out her laptop and began writing. If something happened to her, if the research was suppressed or destroyed, she needed to leave a record. A clear, detailed account of everything they'd discovered. The words flowed for hours, a mixture of historical documentation and personal narrative. She described finding the daguerreotype, decoding Thomas Whitmore's journal, meeting Arthur Pemberton. She laid out the evidence systematically, building a case that would convince skeptics while honoring the truth of what the Whitmore brothers had endured. As dawn broke over Savannah, Rebecca finished the first draft of what would become her most important work. She titled it simply, "The Assembly of Progress, Organized Experimentation and the Theft of Freedom in Antebellum, Georgia." The subtitle came to her as she watched the sunrise, "In memory of those who could not speak." Arthur Pemberton died 3 weeks later. Not from cancer, but from a fall down the stairs of his historic home. The police ruled it an accident, noting his weakened condition from chemotherapy. Rebecca attended the funeral, standing in the back of the church as Savannah's elite paid their respects to one of the city's old families. She noticed 3 men in dark suits who didn't sit with the other mourners. They stood along the wall, watching the attendees with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. When she tried to photograph them discreetly with her phone, one made direct eye contact and shook his head slowly, a warning. After the service, Marcus pulled her aside. "Arthur's death wasn't an accident. You can't know that. He called me 2 days before he died, said he'd remembered something else, something crucial about his grandfather's research. We were supposed to meet the next day. He never showed up. The next thing I know, he's dead from a fall." Marcus's jaw was tight. "They killed him, Rebecca, to stop him from sharing whatever he'd remembered. Even if that's true, we can't prove it, and making wild accusations will only discredit our research. Then what do we do?" Rebecca looked around the cemetery, at the marble headstones marking generations of Savannah families. How many secrets were buried here? How many voices had been silenced? "We finish the work. We publish everything. We make sure Arthur Pemberton's death, like the Whitmore brothers' deaths, isn't in vain." They returned to their research with renewed urgency. Rebecca submitted her paper to 3 top journals in American history. 2 rejected it immediately, citing insufficient evidence for extraordinary claims. The third, the Journal of Southern Historical Studies, requested revisions but expressed serious interest. Meanwhile, Marcus continued investigating the modern disappearances. He'd been contacted by a woman named Sandra Reeves, whose son Jake had vanished 2 years earlier. Jake had been a pre-med student at Armstrong State, recruited for what was described as a cutting-edge neuroscience study with generous compensation. Sandra agreed to meet them at a diner outside Savannah. She was in her 50s, with the exhausted look of someone who'd spent years fighting bureaucracy and dead ends. She brought a box of Jake's belongings, his laptop, journals, correspondence about the study. The police said he ran away, Sandra told them, her voice bitter. They said 23-year-old men make their own choices, that maybe he didn't want to be a doctor after all, that I should accept he's moved on. But Jake wouldn't do that. We were close. He was excited about medical school. Something happened to him. Rebecca looked through the correspondence. Jake had responded to a flyer posted at the university, advertising a sleep study examining the effects of various stimuli on REM patterns. The compensation was substantial. $5,000 for a month-long study involving 3 overnight sessions per week. Did he say anything about the study? Marcus asked. What it involved? Where it was conducted? He went for an initial screening. Said the facility was nice, very professional. They did basic medical tests, psychological evaluations. He passed and was scheduled to start the following week. That was the last time I saw him. Sandra's voice broke. He texted me that first night, said everything was fine. The next morning his phone went dead. When I called the number on the flyer, it was disconnected. I went to the university, but they had no record of any approved sleep study. The flyer had been taken down. Did Jake keep any paperwork? Consent forms, contact information? Sandra shook her head. Everything was electronic. They said it was more environmentally friendly. He signed all the forms on a tablet at the screening. I've tried to find any paper trail, but it's like the study never existed. Marcus pulled up his database on his laptop. Can you tell me the date Jake disappeared? Sandra gave him the date. Marcus typed, then froze. 3 other young men disappeared within 2 weeks of that date. Same age range, same area. One was also recruited for a medical study. The others just vanished. You think they're connected? I think, Rebecca said carefully, that there's a pattern here that deserves serious investigation. Sandra, would you be willing to speak publicly about this? To help us raise awareness about these disappearances? Sandra met her eyes. If there's any chance it helps find Jake, or prevents another mother from going through this, I'll do whatever you need. Over the following weeks, Marcus and Rebecca connected with 12 other families whose sons had disappeared under similar circumstances. Not all were connected to medical studies, but the patterns were striking. Young men in their late teens or early 20s, good students, no history of mental health issues or substance abuse, vanishing without a trace. Some had left behind cryptic messages. One boy's final text to his mother read, "They're not who they said they were. If I don't come home, look for the others." Another had posted on social media the day before he disappeared. Sometimes progress requires sacrifice. I hope I'm strong enough. Rebecca created a timeline, mapping the disappearances against the historical data from the Assembly of Progress. The geographic clustering was undeniable. The demographic patterns were consistent. And several of the young men had been recruited by organizations with financial ties to descendants of original Assembly families. This is enough, Marcus said. We need to take this to the FBI. This isn't just historical research anymore. This is an active criminal conspiracy. Rebecca agreed. They compiled their evidence and requested a meeting with the FBI's Savannah field office. The agent who met with them, Special Agent David Kowalski, listened politely as they presented their findings. Then he closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. Dr. Morrison, Dr. Chen, I appreciate the time you've put into this research. But what you're describing is a conspiracy spanning nearly 2 centuries, involving some of the most prominent families in the Southeast, with no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no proof that any crime is currently being committed. Even if I believed everything you're telling me, I couldn't get a warrant based on historical documents and statistical clustering. What about the families? Rebecca asked. These are real people whose children have disappeared. Doesn't that warrant investigation? We've investigated many of these cases. Some are still open, but young adults do sometimes make choices their families don't understand. They move away, cut contact, start new lives. Without evidence of foul play, there's not much we can do. Marcus pulled out his phone, showing Kowalski the photo of the property they'd visited. What about this facility? The one being developed on land owned by these families? Agricultural development on private property isn't a crime. And you were warned about trespassing, which tells me they're exercising their legal rights to control access to their land. Kowalski stood, signaling the meeting was over. Look, I understand you believe something sinister is happening. Maybe you're right. But I need evidence that would convince a judge. Get me that, and we'll talk. Until then, my advice is to focus on your academic research and let law enforcement handle criminal investigations. They left the FBI office frustrated and discouraged. But Rebecca's phone rang before they reached the parking lot. It was Dr. Eleanor Hayes, editor of the Journal of Southern Historical Studies. Rebecca, I finished reviewing your revised submission. It's extraordinary work. We want to publish it as our lead article in the spring issue. But I need to warn you, this is going to create a firestorm. Are you prepared for that? Rebecca looked at Marcus, who nodded. Yes, we're ready. Good. Because I suspect you're going to face significant pushback, possibly even legal challenges. Make sure you have everything documented, every source verified. We'll support you, but you need to be bulletproof. The article was scheduled for publication in March. Rebecca and Marcus spent the intervening months strengthening their research, tracking down additional sources, and preparing for the inevitable backlash. They also continued working with the families of disappeared young men, building a network of people who refused to accept official explanations. In February, Sandra Reeves called Rebecca at 3 a.m, her voice shaking. They found a body in the marsh near that property you were investigating. The police think it's Jake. Rebecca and Marcus drove to the scene at dawn. The area was cordoned off, police and forensic teams working in the early morning light. The body had been discovered by a kayaker, partially buried in the marsh mud, probably exposed by recent erosion. A detective allowed Rebecca to observe from a distance. Given her research into the area's history, what she saw made her stomach turn. The young man, if it was indeed Jake Reeves, had been dead for at least a year, maybe longer. But visible even from yards away were marks on his body, scarring on his neck and arms that looked disturbingly familiar. Marcus photographed everything he could from their position, zooming in on the marks. Later, comparing those images to the daguerreotype of the Whitmore brothers, the similarity was undeniable. "They're still doing it," Rebecca whispered. "After all these years, they're still doing it." The autopsy report, when it was finally released, listed cause of death as drowning, with notes about unusual scarring, consistent with medical procedures, origin unknown. Jake's mother confirmed it was her son through dental records. The detective investigating seemed uncomfortable when Rebecca asked about the scars. "We're looking into it, but there's no evidence of foul play beyond the drowning itself, which could have been accidental." Accidental! He's been missing for 2 years and turns up dead in a marsh with unexplained scars on his body. And you think that's accidental? What I think doesn't matter, Dr. Morrison. What matters is what I can prove. And right now, all I can prove is that a young man drowned. If you have evidence suggesting otherwise, I'd be happy to review it. Rebecca provided him with everything she had: the historical research, the pattern of disappearances, the connections to the families developing the nearby property. The detective took notes but made no promises. Jake Reeves's death made local news, but it was buried on page 6, overshadowed by coverage of upcoming elections and a corporate merger involving one of Savannah's largest employers. Sandra Reeves appeared briefly on camera, begging anyone with information to come forward. No one did. Rebecca's article was published in March to immediate and polarized reaction. Academic reviewers praised the meticulous research and documentation. Several historians called it groundbreaking work that shed new light on antebellum medical ethics and the abuse of power by Southern elites. But the backlash was fierce. 3 families identified in the article as having members in the Assembly of Progress issued statements denying any connection to the organization or to modern disappearances. 2 threatened lawsuits for defamation. Op-eds appeared in Savannah and Charleston newspapers questioning Rebecca's methodology and suggesting she was exploiting tragic disappearances to promote sensational theories. Most damaging was a letter signed by 12 prominent Georgia historians questioning the authenticity of the Thomas Whitmore journal entries and suggesting the entire Assembly of Progress might be a fabrication based on misinterpreted documents. Rebecca responded with a point-by-point rebuttal, but the damage was done. Her credibility was under attack, and with it, the legitimacy of the family's concerns about their missing sons. Then, 3 weeks after publication, Rebecca received an unmarked envelope at the Historical Society. Inside was a single photograph, recent, showing her leaving her apartment. Written on the back in block letters, "Some truths are better left buried. For your own safety, abandon this research." She called the police, who took a report but offered little hope of identifying the sender. She showed the photo to Marcus, who'd received a similar message. "They're escalating," he said. "First Arthur Pemberton, now direct threats to us." Which means we're close to something they desperately want hidden. That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the Whitmore brothers, about Jake Reeves, about all the young men who'd trusted the wrong promises and paid with their lives. She thought about Thomas Whitmore's journal entry. "We are no longer free men. We are their experiment, and they care nothing for our suffering." Freedom. That was the core of it, wasn't it? The Assembly of Progress, in all its incarnations across nearly 2 centuries, represented the ultimate theft of freedom. The freedom to control one's own body, to make informed choices, to refuse participation in someone else's vision of advancement. It was a violation that transcended any single era. Slavery had been the most obvious example, but this was different, more insidious. These were free citizens, people with rights and protections, who'd been systematically exploited by those who saw them as raw material for experimentation. Rebecca opened her laptop and began writing again. Not an academic article this time, but something more personal. A statement about what she'd discovered and why it mattered. About the responsibility of historians to speak truth, even when powerful people wanted silence. She wrote, "Throughout American history, there have been those who believed that progress justified any cost, that the advancement of knowledge or society or civilization warranted the sacrifice of individual liberty." The Assembly of Progress was one manifestation of this ideology, but it was not unique. We see echoes in the Tuskegee experiments, in involuntary sterilization programs, in countless instances where vulnerable populations were exploited in the name of the greater good. The Whitmore brothers remind us that freedom is not just the absence of legal bondage. True freedom means sovereignty over one's own body, the right to informed consent, the power to say no even to those who claim to serve progress. When that freedom is violated, when individuals become subjects rather than citizens, we have betrayed the fundamental principles that should define us as a society. The question we must ask ourselves is, how do we honor those who lost their freedom? How do we prevent their suffering from being forgotten or dismissed? And most urgently, how do we ensure that the ideology that destroyed them is not still operating today, under new names, but with the same fundamental disregard for human dignity? She posted the statement on her professional blog, knowing it would likely end any chance of a tenured position, but not caring anymore. Some things were more important than career advancement. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Sandra Reeves shared it, along with dozens of other families who'd lost children to unexplained disappearances. Students organized protests, demanding investigation into the patterns Rebecca had identified. Local news picked up the story, giving it coverage the academic article never received. And Marcus called with news. The FBI is reopening several cases. Agent Kowalski says the publicity has generated new leads. People are coming forward with information they were afraid to share before. What kind of information? One person claims to have escaped from a facility conducting unauthorized medical trials. Another says they witnessed someone being taken against their will. It's preliminary, but it's more than we had before. Rebecca felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe the truth really could set them free. Maybe the Whitmore brothers and Jake Reeves and all the others wouldn't be forgotten after all. The facility was raided on a Tuesday morning in late April. Federal agents, armed with warrants based on information from multiple sources, descended on the property Rebecca and Marcus had observed months earlier. What they found shocked even the most cynical investigators. Hidden beneath a facade of agricultural buildings was a sophisticated medical complex. State-of-the-art equipment, patient rooms, observation facilities, and extensive documentation of experiments conducted on dozens of subjects over the past 15 years. Agent Kowalski called Rebecca with the news. "You were right about all of it. We found evidence of unauthorized human experimentation, falsified consent forms, and connection to at least 23 of the disappearances you documented. The scope of this is staggering." Rebecca felt validation mixed with horror. The subjects, are any of them still alive? "We found 6 individuals on site, all young men, ages 19 to 26. They're in various states of physical and psychological trauma. Medical teams are evaluating them now, but it's clear they've been subjected to prolonged experimentation without proper consent or oversight." "What about Jake Reeves?" Kowalski paused. "We found his records. He was here, Rebecca. They conducted neurological experiments, testing responses to various stimuli, pushing the boundaries of what the human brain can endure. When he tried to refuse further participation, citing the terms of the consent form he'd signed, they made an example of him, just like Jonathan Whitmore." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. Sandra needs to know. She needs to know what happened to her son. "We'll handle notifications properly, but Rebecca, you should know this is going to get much bigger. The people running this facility, the ones funding it, they're connected to exactly the families you identified in your research. We're talking about doctors, researchers, philanthropists who've been respected members of the community for generations." Over the following weeks, the story dominated national news. The facility, officially operated by a research foundation called the Progress Institute, had been conducting experiments aimed at enhancing human cognitive and physical capabilities. The subjects were recruited with promises of compensation and contribution to medical advancement, but the consent forms were deliberately vague about the nature of the procedures. Once subjects arrived, they were isolated, monitored constantly, and subjected to increasingly invasive procedures. Those who tried to leave or refused participation faced threats, intimidation, and in some cases, physical force. The 6 survivors told stories of psychological manipulation, experimental drugs, surgical procedures performed without proper anesthesia, and a culture that viewed them as test subjects rather than human beings. The public reaction was explosive. Protests erupted in Savannah, Charleston, and Atlanta. Families of the missing demanded answers. Elected officials called for investigations. and the descendants of Assembly of Progress members, the ones who'd funded and protected the facility, faced intense scrutiny. 3 prominent physicians were arrested and charged with assault, false imprisonment, and unauthorized human experimentation. 2 fled the country. The Foundation's board members, all scions of families connected to the original assembly, lawyered up and released statements expressing shock and denying knowledge of any improper activities. Rebecca was invited to testify before a congressional committee investigating oversight failures that had allowed the facility to operate for 15 years. She brought the daguerreotype of the Whitmore brothers, placing it on the table in front of the assembled legislators. In 1847, she began, 7 young men from a respected Georgia family were subjected to medical experimentation without their consent. They were promised education and advancement. Instead, they received torture disguised as progress. Most died. 1 escaped, but carried the trauma for the rest of his life. For more than a century and a half, I believe this pattern has persisted. Different names, different methods, but the same fundamental betrayal of trust. The facility you're investigating is not an aberration. It's the latest iteration of an ideology that sees certain people, usually young, usually vulnerable, as raw material for experimentation. The question before this committee is not just how to punish those responsible for the recent crimes. It's how to ensure that we, as a society, never again allow the pursuit of progress to override basic human rights. How do we protect the freedom of every individual to control their own body, to refuse participation in experiments, to say no to those who claim to serve the greater good? She looked at each committee member in turn. The Whitmore brothers couldn't speak for themselves. Jake Reeves and the 22 other young men who died at that facility can't speak for themselves. But the 6 survivors can, and so can the hundreds of families affected by these disappearances. Are you willing to listen? The testimony went viral. Rebecca became an unwilling spokesperson for victims' families, appearing on news programs and in documentaries about the case. Marcus worked with federal prosecutors, helping them understand the historical context and patterns that connected modern crimes to past abuses. Sandra Reeves filed a wrongful death lawsuit on behalf of her son, naming the Progress Institute, its board members, and the facility's medical staff. 12 other families joined her. The legal process would take years, but it gave them a way to fight back, to demand accountability. In Savannah, the Historical Society created a permanent exhibit about the Whitmore brothers, using the daguerreotype as the centerpiece. The exhibit didn't shy away from the uncomfortable truths that respected citizens had participated in systematic abuse, that institutions had failed to protect vulnerable people, that the pursuit of progress had been used to justify unconscionable cruelty. Rebecca stood in the gallery on opening day, looking at the 7 faces she'd come to know so well. Thomas, who'd survived and built a new life, but never forgot his brother's suffering. Samuel, who'd lost his sight. Marcus, robbed of his voice. David, plagued by seizures. Jonathan, murdered for trying to resist. And the 2 others whose names appeared only in faded documents, their individual stories lost to time. An elderly woman approached her, leaning on a cane. "Dr. Morrison, I wanted to thank you for this. My great-great-grandfather was Thomas Whitmore. I grew up hearing whispers about family secrets, about brothers who disappeared, but no one would talk about it openly. Seeing this exhibit, knowing the truth is finally out, it means everything." Rebecca fought back tears. "I'm honored to have played a part in telling their story. They deserve to be remembered. My grandfather used to say that Thomas never really escaped, that he carried the weight of his brother's deaths until the day he died, but maybe now, maybe he can finally rest." That evening, Marcus joined Rebecca for dinner at her favorite Savannah restaurant overlooking the river. They'd both aged visibly over the past year, the stress and intensity of the investigation taking its toll. But there was also a sense of relief, of a burden partially lifted. "The journal article came out today," Marcus said. "The one about systemic failures in research oversight, already getting significant attention. Good. We need to keep the pressure on, make sure the reforms actually happen and aren't just window dressing." Marcus raised his glass. "To the Whitmore brothers, to Jake Reeves, to everyone who lost their freedom to other people's ambitions." Rebecca clinked her glass against his. "And to the survivors, may they find peace and justice." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun set over the Savannah River. The same river where Jonathan Whitmore's body had been found nearly 2 centuries earlier. The same landscape that had witnessed so much suffering hidden beneath layers of civility and progress. "Do you think it's really over?" Rebecca asked. "Or will someone else, somewhere else, decide that their vision of progress justifies sacrificing others?" Marcus considered the question. "Honestly, I think the ideology that drove the Assembly of Progress is too seductive to ever completely disappear. The belief that some people know better, that the ends justify the means, that sacrifice for the greater good is noble rather than cruel. It's woven into how we think about advancement and achievement. That's a depressing thought, maybe, but it's also why work like yours matters, why remembering matters. Every time someone tells these stories, every time we refuse to let the victims be forgotten, we push back against that ideology. We remind ourselves and others that progress built on violated freedom isn't progress at all. It's just cruelty in disguise." Rebecca thought about that as they finished dinner and walked through Savannah's historic district. The beautiful squares, the elegant homes, the carefully preserved architecture, all of it built on layers of history, both glorious and terrible. The city had been founded on ideals of liberty and self-governance, yet had sustained itself through slavery and exploitation. The contradiction was quintessentially American. But so was the eventual reckoning, the slow, painful process of confronting uncomfortable truths and trying to do better. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't fast, but it was necessary. Back home, Rebecca opened her laptop one more time. She'd been contacted by a publisher interested in turning her research into a book for general audiences, a chance to reach beyond academic circles, to make the Whitmore brothers' story accessible to everyone. She pulled up the daguerreotype image and studied those 7 young faces one more time. What had they been thinking in that moment? Had they already been marked, already subjected to the Assembly's initial procedures? Or was this photograph taken before, during a brief period when they still believed the promises made to them? She'd never know for certain. But she could tell their story with honesty and respect. She could make sure their suffering wasn't dismissed as ancient history, but understood as part of a larger pattern of abuse that required constant vigilance to prevent. Rebecca began typing the book's introduction. "Freedom is fragile. It can be stolen incrementally, through promises and persuasion, until the victim realizes too late that they've surrendered control of their own life." The story you're about to read is about 7 young men who learned this truth in the most horrific way possible. But it's also about how their story, preserved against all odds, helped expose a conspiracy that spanned centuries and saved lives in our own time. This is not just history. This is a warning and a call to action. As long as there are people who believe their vision of progress justifies sacrificing others, as long as institutions fail to protect the vulnerable, as long as we're willing to look away from inconvenient truths, the pattern will repeat. The names and methods may change, but the fundamental violation remains the same. The Whitmore brothers cannot speak for themselves, but we can speak for them. We can learn from their suffering, and we can commit ourselves to ensuring that no one else endures what they endured, that freedom remains sacrosanct, and that progress never again becomes an excuse for cruelty. She saved the document and closed her laptop. Outside her window, Savannah slept beneath ancient oaks and Spanish moss, beautiful and haunted. A city built on contradictions. Tomorrow she would continue the work, speaking, writing, researching, keeping the memory alive. For tonight, she allowed herself to hope that somewhere, somehow, Thomas Whitmore knew his story had finally been told, that his brothers were remembered, that their suffering had not been in vain. 6 months later, the book was published to critical acclaim. The Progress Institute's board members faced criminal charges. The 6 survivors began the long process of recovery, supported by counseling and compensation. And families across the country found solace in knowing that their missing sons were part of a larger story now, no longer dismissed or forgotten. Rebecca returned to Savannah one last time before accepting a position at a university in New England, a fresh start away from the intensity of the past 2 years. She visited the Historical Society, standing before the daguerreotype that had started everything. The exhibit had been expanded to include photographs of Jake Reeves and the other modern victims, creating a visual timeline of exploitation across centuries. Visitors moved through quietly, reading the descriptions, looking at the faces. A young man, no more than 20, stood in front of the Whitmore brothers' photograph for a long time. Finally, he turned to Rebecca. This really happened. People did this to them. Yes, Rebecca said. It really happened. Why? Because they believed in progress more than they believed in freedom. They convinced themselves that their goals justified any means. They forgot that every person has inherent worth and the right to control their own life. The young man looked back at the photograph. We can't let that happen again. No, Rebecca agreed. We can't. She left the museum feeling lighter than she had in months. The work would continue, the fight for justice and accountability. But the story was out now, preserved and protected. The Whitmore brothers had their voice. The lost young men of the Progress Institute had their voice. And as long as people remembered, as long as they refused to accept progress built on stolen freedom, the dead could finally rest. Rebecca walked through Forsyth Park one last time, past the fountain and the azaleas beneath the live oaks that had stood sentinel over Savannah for centuries. The city had kept its secrets for so long, but secrets, she'd learned, had a way of demanding to be told. She thought of Thomas Whitmore's journal entry, the one that had guided her throughout this journey. Look for the others. We are not the first. We will not be the last. She'd looked, she'd found them, and in finding them, she'd helped ensure that their sacrifice meant something, that their stolen freedom became a rallying cry for protecting the freedom of all. As she left Savannah for the last time, Rebecca carried with her the faces of 7 brothers in an 1847 photograph. Frozen in a moment of fear and hope, they'd been silenced but not forever, they'd been erased but not completely. Their story was told now, their voices heard, their freedom, stolen so long ago, honored in the fight to protect it for future generations. And that, Rebecca thought, was the most fitting memorial she could give them. Not just remembrance, but action. Not just history, but justice. Not just the past, but hope for a better future. The road ahead stretched out before her, leading to new challenges and new opportunities. But she carried with her the lesson the Whitmore brothers had taught her, bought with their suffering and paid for with their lives. Freedom is not a given. It must be protected, cherished and defended against those who would sacrifice it for their own ends. And the voices of the silenced, if we listen carefully enough, can guide us toward a more just world. As the sun set behind her and Savannah disappeared in the rearview mirror, Rebecca whispered a final farewell. Rest now. Your story is told. Your freedom is honored, and we will not forget.